Okay. I think we're live.
Wow.
We are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to, well, I guess I'm in my office at CFP, but the rest of us are in all sorts of other locations. So anyways, with all of the craziness that is going on, right, this moment of that really every human being is going through, we really wanted to find moments of opportunity and moments of holiness. So I am really excited for tonight. For those of you who have talked to me at all anytime in the last month, you have probably heard me talk about this book, A Rainbow Thread, and I always get the subtitle wrong, an anthology of queer Jewish texts from the 1st century to 1969. So we've been studying this every Tuesday at CRC. But one of the beauties of this moment, one of the sort of shards of holiness that we're pulling out here, is that we actually have the historian who compiled this incredible text, Noam Sienna, here with us, whatever here with us means right now. So anyways, if you are watching this on Facebook Live, there should be a link in the thread that you can click on if you'd rather join in the Zoom meeting itself, where you can ask questions and you can be a part of the conversation, or feel free to keep watching on Facebook Live. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to you, Noam. Would you tell us? Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi. It's, normally I start by saying it's great to be here in St. Louis or wherever I am, but as it turns out, it's great to be here in my office, in my own home, right from the comfort of Minneapolis. So, so A Rainbow Thread, here's the book, is an anthology. It's a compilation of texts, which I have been gathering for several years now, maybe maybe close to a decade. So by way of introduction, I'll just say a little bit about myself and how I came to compile the book, and then a little bit about sort of what's in it and what's not in it and how it's structured. And then I thought we would dive into reading some texts from the book ourselves, and we'll have some discussion among the four of us, and then hopefully open it up for questions for anybody who is watching. I'm not used to seeing myself present. This is very unusual.
Just one quick note for people who are a part of the Zoom meeting. If you sort of move your mouse around, you should see the option for questions and answers or a chat. We would love to get your questions throughout this, and we'll make sure that Noam sees those. So please.
Okay, so I'm currently a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. I am literally just months away from receiving my PhD in history, with a focus on Jewish culture in the Islamic world in the medieval and early modern periods. But I generally have an interest in all different kinds of areas, aspects of Jewish life. And as a queer person myself, I have always felt interested in trying to understand how I fit in the kind of big picture of the Jewish family tree, through trying to find a connection to Jewish history, to Jewish text, to Jewish heritage. And that was an attempt that started very early on for me, even in my adolescence, when I first came out even. I sort of turned to, I was if we want to say politely, a bookish kind of child. So as a young person, I kind of turned to the world of Jewish text. I turned to my teachers. I did the whole gamut of Jewish elementary school, Jewish middle school, Jewish high school, Jewish summer camp, Jewish karate program, you name it. And I sort of turned to my teachers, I turned to the books that I was reading to try and find any guidance, any kind of role model on what does it mean to live as a queer Jew? What does it mean to grow into a queer Jewish adult, right? That was kind of, as an adolescent, I'm trying to figure out who am I, what am I, in the world, what is my role, and how do I fit into the community as an adult, as an individual member of the community in my own right. And what I was looking for was this book, was really what I was trying to find, but unfortunately it hadn't been written yet. So I started trying to find things on my own throughout college and my graduate work in Jewish history. And eventually it grew into the project which you have before you. So what is in this book and what isn't in this book? So the book is a collection of primary texts. And again, as a historian, my training, is as a historian. So I think that one of the most important and valuable and exciting things that people can do to feel connected to a place or a tradition or a people is to engage directly with primary texts, to have an encounter with a source that is a real encounter between you and a voice from the past. And so I tried as much as possible to select texts that really spoke out of their own voice and limit my own ideas about what I felt was interesting about this text. So this is not really a book about Noam Sienna's ideas about queer Jewish life. And so it's not the kind of book that one could read cover to cover, although I understand that at CRC, that's sort of what you've been doing. It's a pretty bold undertaking. My vision for the book, not to say that you're doing it wrong, it's great, but my hope for the book was that this would be something that people could kind of open to at a random place and dive in, say, Jews in 16th century Brazil, or Jews in 19th century Germany, or Jews in 12th century Spain. Like, what's going on there, and what can a text from that time and place offer me as I try and think about questions around sexuality, questions around gender, and questions around Judaism and Jewish identity more generally. So each text, so just to show you, for those of you who haven't seen the book, I'll just show you the way it works here. So each text has a title that I've given it, and then a short introduction. That's me explaining a little bit about the context, when it was written, who wrote it, if we know sort of some background to help understand it. And then there's the text itself in translation in English. And then the citation, if you want to check my work, you can look it up. And then further reading some examples of other scholars who have written about these texts. Now, many of these texts are not new. In other words, many of these texts are texts that many scholars have written about for centuries, that are well known, that are part of what we would call the Jewish canon. And many of them are new. Many of them are texts that have never been published in English translation, which is exciting to me. And some of them have actually never been published at all. They're completely, they were in archive in a manuscript or something, and they're published here for the very first time. So that's very exciting. It starts in it's arranged chronologically in 3 sections. And again, those of you who've looked at the book have seen this. The first section is what I call pre-modern voices. So that covers the ancient and medieval worlds from the 1st century CE to 1500. The second section, early modern voices, covers loosely what we might call the Renaissance through the end of the Enlightenment. So let's say 1500 to 1900. And then the last section, modern voices, is the 20th century from 1900 until 1969. So let me just say one word about why starting in the 1st century and why ending in 1969. And then maybe we'll dive into some texts. So why the 1st century? There's a few reasons. First of all, I wanted to make sure that the texts that people were encountering, especially at the beginning, because I imagined that you could, people might open it to the first page and you have a few pages to kind of hook them before they decide whether they're going to take it off the shelf or not. And I realized that I really wanted to surprise people with where I began. I didn't want to begin in the usual place, because I think the usual kind of expected place to begin a book like this would be with Leviticus, with sources from the Torah. And I didn't really want to do that. I didn't want to start with Leviticus because I think it would send the wrong message about what the rest of the book is going to be like. And also, more importantly, I'm not a biblical scholar. There are many very well regarded theologians and biblical scholars who have written about sexuality in the Torah and about Leviticus specifically, and they're cited in the book. So if you want to start with Leviticus, there are already in the last 20 years, there have been a number of really important books and articles that have been written about that. And I felt like I was interested in starting in an unusual place and kind of bringing people to appreciate. I think, when I was growing up, the timeline of Jewish history that I learned in school, like the trajectory of like the stops on the Jewish timeline were Bible, rabbinics like Mishnah and Talmud, maybe the medieval ages like Maimonides, and then the European Enlightenment, Israel, the Holocaust, Israel, America. So it's like, in between like the Talmud, in between Maimonides and the Enlightenment, there's about 600 years of Jewish history that, things happened in. So I particularly wanted to bring a real breadth of chronology. So I started in the first century, not with rabbinic texts, again, surprisingly, but actually with Greek Jewish texts, written in Greek from the Hellenistic period, then rabbinic texts through the Middle Ages, the early modern period, the Renaissance, the 18th century, etc., up into 1969. Why end in 1969? So 1969 was the year of of many things. It was a big year in the world. And one of the things that happened was what we now call the Stonewall riots or the Stonewall uprising, which was a series of police raids on a gay bar in Greenwich Village in New York, which was called the Stonewall Inn. So that's why it's called Stonewall riots. And it catalyzed a new sense of energy and urgency around what in those days was called the fight for homosexual rights, or for homophile rights, even some people. And now we would say like civil rights for LGBTQ people in general. And that almost immediately after Stonewall, there was an explosion of new organizations and activism and visibility, and people were in newspapers and people were on radio and on television. And within a year, the landscape of discourse, especially in the United States, the discourse around sexuality and gender, both in general and specifically within the Jewish community, was dramatically different. And by a year later, the riots on Stonewall were commemorated with a march, which evolved into what we now know as the annual Pride Parade, which is part of a whole Pride month in many places. So the problem with that, which is all great and important history, but the problem is that a lot of people mistakenly point to Stonewall as a kind of beginning point. Like, this is when people started talking about gay rights. This is when gay people were invented. Like, it's anachronistic, that someone might say it's anachronistic to talk about queer Judaism or gay Judaism or trans Judaism in the past, because like those identities didn't exist until 1969. And I wanted to really push people to challenge that assumption. It's true that the language that we're going to encounter in the book around gender and sexuality in many cases is different than the language that we would use today. And in many cases, the way that people thought about their identities, or whether they even considered gender or sexuality to be part of their identity at all, is in many cases very different than how we understand things today. But 1969 was a turning point, but it was not a beginning point. It was not an originating point. It was a transformation, but even before 1969, we can still meaningfully speak about what it means to understand the diversities of genders and sexualities in a Jewish context, in Jewish society, and in the Jewish experience. So that's the last thing that I'll say about what's in the book and sort of the genre, the assorted genres of texts that are in it. There are a lot of different kinds of texts in this book. So on the cover, I say an anthology of queer Jewish texts. And both the word queer and the word Jewish, I'm using very expansively. I'm using the word queer in the title to refer to any kind of experience that is related either to sexual, romantic, erotic, or even emotional intimacy or desire for intimacy between people of the same sex, and anything that relates to movement across or between or outside of standard gendered categories. Those two circles overlap to a large degree because in many times and places, people who transgress norms of sexuality are also assumed to transgress norms of gender and vice versa. So, but that's kind of loosely what the word queer means. But the word Jewish is also a kind of loose umbrella because there are many different ways that I have classified a text as a Jewish text. Some of the texts are texts that are written in what we think of as standard Jewish languages: Hebrew, Yiddish, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Spanish, et cetera, et cetera. Many of the texts are written by Jews, but in other languages, in French, in Dutch, in Persian, in Greek, and in English even. And some of the texts are actually even written by non-Jews about Jewish people. So all of those different ways are ways of getting to a kind of experience. Like, what does it mean to experience the world as a Jew and as someone who sits in that intersection of Jewish community and identity and what we'll call loosely LGBTQ gender and identity? There are a lot of different ways of getting at that experience. And so I've tried to broaden the scope as much as possible to look for different ways of getting to that, experience. And that's a technique, that's a methodology that was pioneered by the Jewish feminist movement and by Jewish women who were writing and thinking and speaking about this since the late 1960s, early 1970s. Jewish women activists and Jewish feminists and Jewish women theologians were already saying in the early 70s, it's not enough all this time that we had the bookshelf, the canon on our bookshelf of what we thought Jewish life and Jewish law and Jewish text and Jewish thought was. And all this time, our bookshelf has just been Jewish men's thought and Jewish men's lives and Jewish men's ideas. We need to reread the texts that are on our bookshelf, but we also need to look for other voices that didn't even make it onto the bookshelf. So those are the two moves that I'm trying to do kind of at the same time. Which is all to say that the book is many different things. Each text is kind of it's kind of like a tapas bar, of many little different dishes, and each text is kind of a jump into a different flavor. So let's jump into a few different texts together, if that's all right. So I'm gonna now, let's see if, well, maybe you'll figure this out. So how are we gonna do this? Everyone's gonna turn on now. Is that right? Or just the four of us?
Yeah, let me explain to everyone who's listening.
Great, thank you.
So in a moment, what we're going to do is we're going to present, Noam's going to teach us 3 or 4 of the texts that he's compiled. And we're going to start with a discussion of the panelists here. So let me just go ahead and introduce the panelists that we've got.
Great, thank you.
We have Maharat Rory Picker-Nice, who's the executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council. Is that what the JCRC stands for, Rory?
Yes, that is.
For anyone particularly in St. Louis who doesn't know Rory and doesn't know the incredible work she's doing at the JCRC, I encourage you to get to know her, and just really amazing that we have her, and just an incredible resource and a gift to St. Louis that you're here. So thank you for being you. And also introducing Shira Berkowitz, former advocacy director at Central Reform Congregation, currently at Promo, an LGBTQ rights and advocacy organization here in Missouri, doing incredible work If you've seen some of the recent sort of organizing around the awful 15, 16 now LGBTQ, anti-LGBTQ bills that the Missouri legislature trying to pass, Shira has been one of the main organizers helping to push back against that. It's been really inspiring, and I am proud to call Shira a lifelong friend. We have pictures of us from when we were like 9 years old.
So great.
Shira, I'll let you unmute yourself. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a conversation, the four of us. Noam will teach us a text, and then we're going to open up the conversation to anyone who is a part of the Zoom meeting. So again, if you were on Facebook Live right now, if you click on the link at the top, you should have a link to the Zoom meeting that you can join so that you can participate. Anyone who's participating, I invite you to use the Q&A feature to let us know your questions or the chat. And if you'd like to come on, we can move you over so you're on the video too. So with that, Noam, let me turn it back over.
Great. And do the four of you have texts in front of you? Do you have the book? You have the book? Oh, look at that. I love it. Beautiful.
I am going to go ahead and screen share.
Let's see. Ooh, nice. Oh, look at that. Amazing. Okay, so we're sort of jumping ahead. We're skipping over the texts, and those of you who have been attending this CRC class regularly have looked at some of the ancient texts and the medieval texts. They're very, very interesting. Some of them are very rich. I urge you, those of you who haven't yet taken a look, dive into those. We're going to skip over the medieval texts, the 15th century, the 16th century, my personal favorite, the 17th century, and we don't have time. So we're going to jump into sort of the middle of the book here, actually almost exactly in the middle of the book. So we're starting in the early 18th century, which is a very exciting time. I'll just say as a historian, the 18th century is a very exciting time. It's a time when a lot of things are changing. It's a time when society is especially societies in Europe and in the Islamic world are encountering each other in a really new way, and people are starting to think about themselves, their identity, their place in the world. A lot of things are happening. So it's important to remember, this text didn't just come out of nowhere. As we'll see, there are some really interesting things going on. So this is from a book of Musar, which is some of you might be familiar with the Musar movement. It's a genre of literature that aims to help people cultivate particular kinds of behavior, sort of like what we might call therapy today. So this particular book of Musar was written by an Ottoman Jewish scholar from the city of Izmir in Turkey, Elia HaKohen HaItamari. And this is from a section where he's talking about sexual desires. So he has a whole chapter about how to deal with sexual desires. And what do you do if you have sexual desires that are prompting you towards behaviors that he considers to be forbidden by Jewish law? So maybe if one of you want to read the beginning of the text aloud, and then we'll have a little chat about it.
Rory, you up for it?
Sure. Okay. So starting with his inclination here.
Yeah.
Okay. If his inclination tempts him to lie with a man as with a woman, let him consider that once the beard of his partner, nirva, is full, and especially if they meet when they are both grown old, they will feel so much shame and embarrassment and disgrace and dishonor as they remember how they had lain with each other. Furthermore, neither of them will be able to take pride in performing mitzvot in public in front of the other, even if he has repented. Surely it would bring shame to take pride in himself in front of one who has angered his creator, for he will remember the time of the deed by which he was polluted and he will feel disgraced.
Great. You can actually, we'll just skip the next paragraph. The next paragraph then goes on to say, similarly, in particular, if one of them is poor and one of them is rich, it'll be embarrassing. And if the other one is rich and the other one is poor, it'll still be embarrassing. So we'll skip that, and then let's go to the last paragraph. When a man.
When a man considers these things, it is practically impossible that his inclination will overpower him to lie with a man. For immediately when this notion occurs to him, his blood will congeal, and certainly also when he thinks of the great ignominy and disgust and the strangeness of the act itself.
Great, thank you. Whew. So this is the kind of text, I'll just say to start things off, this is the kind of text that often people feel uncomfortable with for good reason. It's not a comfortable text. And it's the kind of thing that sometimes people say to me, like, how could you put this kind of text in the book? Like, this is exactly the wrong kind of attitude that we don't want to give people the wrong idea. And by including it and allowing it to be read, you are, you're doing a disservice. And I would argue that actually even these kinds of negative texts, even these texts that speak very harshly or condemnatory, actually have a lot of value. So I'm wondering, before I say what I think, I'm wondering if the three of you have thoughts on what jumps out at you at what might be the possible value of reading this text and thinking about it.
I mean, immediately, I'll jump in, just say, like, immediately it just feels like there's too much protest, right? Like, just that, right? So the fact that he has clearly put so much thought into this process, this is not something that he's just being passive about. Like, he's clearly spent time on this.
Yeah. So in other words, and this is true in general when you read, especially legal texts, halachic texts, when people discuss what people shouldn't be doing at great length with a lot of specific detail, it usually is a good indication that is what people are doing. So this tells us something about, the kinds of relationships that Haitamari might actually have seen happening in his community around him, that people actually are doing these kinds of things. And he's trying to dictate, this is how you should feel about it. So we can kind of read between the lines to say the fact that he's so over the top in his condemnation tells us that he is not seeing this attitude around him. He wants this to be, he's portraying the world that he wants to see around him. But we don't have to take him we don't have to take his position. We can say, thank you for describing this, but we actually are not going to take that approach.
I'm struck that he seems to suggest that the reason not to do this is entirely about social costs.
Yeah, great. That's a great observation, right? In other words, his conclusion is you might be tempted to engage in a relationship with another man. And I'll say also, it's telling that the you is a man, right? He's not interested in female readers. He's not addressing women. It's when he says, the person who's reading this book is obviously a man. You might be tempted to lie with another man, but if you really stop and think about it, you'll realize that it's shameful, it's embarrassing, it's disgusting, and it's going to disgrace you. And if you're in public and you see each other, you won't even be able to look at each other. It'll be so embarrassing. And if you think about that, then it's impossible that you'll be tempted to do that. So that allows us space to say, we don't have to buy into that conditional, like, if then, like if it's the case that you're going to feel shame and disgust, then it's impossible that you'll be tempted to do this. But what if we don't feel shame and disgust? Like, what if we actually change the social norms such that it is not disgraceful and shameful and embarrassing to be seen with your partner? Then the whole construct falls apart. His whole argument that he's built actually no longer holds, the force that it did. Other things that I wanted to, let me just look at my notes here. Shira, do you have any thoughts that you want to jump in here?
I feel compelled to relate it to very similarly how the Ottonian Empire at the time dictated religion in a way. Like if people are starting to think, then we have to prescribe religious belief. So why not prescribe feeling outside of that belief system as well? But this feels like it's just going to fall apart because we will feel what we need to feel.
Right.
And it's not like we can just paint a picture of what we're supposed to feel and then we'll feel God here. It seems messy. It seems like very messy logic.
It is. And I think, I suspect that that's exactly what happened, right? In other words, this strategy doesn't actually work, right? And I'm sure you can speak to this from your experience, or all of you, right? If someone comes to you and says, I'm having these feelings, I know that there's this part of myself that is really true, but I'm just going to keep telling myself that it's wrong and shameful and embarrassing, and that'll solve the problem. Right? I think we all know, that doesn't actually solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem today, and I don't think it solves the problem in the 18th century. And in fact, if you look at other texts, you'll see that that's exactly the case. We have other examples, and even from a similar context, if you go forward a few pages, you'll see that we won't read this all together. But if you see source number 52 is from also from the Ottoman Empire, from the city of Salonika. Just a few decades later, just 50 years later, another rabbi says explicitly that he has trouble with the young men in his yeshiva because many of the young men are sleeping with each other, and he can't seem to put a stop to it. And he gives examples from his own experience that, students would say that they're going to do chavruta study. They're going up to study in partners. They go up to the attic, and then he caught them having sex. So, it's happening in his yeshiva in the 18th century in the Ottoman Empire. And what this tells us is this isn't a theoretical conversation for Hakohen Itamari or for Molcho or for any of these people. This is happening. It's not always recorded, but we have enough documentation to know that when it is recorded, we can say, wow, this is really something that is happening in people's communities around them. And, they're trying to find a way to understand it and to try and have it make sense to them. And the way for them in most cases is to root it in the social context around them. In other words, it doesn't, even for Hakohen Itamari, it seems like what really the worst thing about same-sex relations between men, at least for him, is that it carries social stigma. It carries social shame. So to me, that's a pretty weak argument, because if we get rid of social shame, then we actually have removed a lot of the problem. So I actually enjoy this text because it's comforting to me to think the only thing that was standing in your way was massive stigma and the fear of shame. That's not so bad. You can get over that. We can get over. We in many ways we have. In many ways we haven't.
Is there something in here though that correlates the stigma or of embarrassment to the stigma of the female body? In those moments.
I for sure. So I think there's two things. One is you'll notice, and I put this actually in the English, that the way that he talks about the two partners is with sexual language. The active partner is called the rovea, and the passive partner, the other partner, is called the nirva, which literally you could translate as, penetrating and penetrated, not to put too fine a point on it. But this is sexual language, and it's language that relates to the act of penetration. In other words, part of the reason why it's shameful for men to engage in sexual activity is because it means that one of them is being treated like a woman, right? Nirva, it's shameful for a man to be in that position. A man should always be the rovea, should always be the active partner. And so underneath homophobia, as is so often the case, is actually misogyny. So here's what's really shameful here is it's shameful for a man to be treated like a woman. And that's another thing that, again, if we can undo some of that, if we can do some of the work in our social circles of undoing the hierarchy where it's not shameful to be a woman and it's not shameful to be in a role like
any
a woman,
version of masculinity,
right? Then any version of masculinity or femininity or combination is going to be okay. And that, so that's, I think that's a really great point to bring up here. And a lot of these texts, once you start digging into them, you get down to really the core is, even though it seems like it's really about, in this case, sexual relations, at the core of it is really a fear about gender, which is like really so often the case. Yep. Let's see how we're doing on time. Great. Let's jump forward a few decades, actually about 100. Let's jump forward about 150 years.
And while we're doing that, just a reminder to everyone who's in the Zoom meeting, if you've got questions, we'd love to hear your questions. And we'd love to have Noam answer your questions too. So there's a little Q&A button. If you move your mouse around, just type it in there and let us know.
Yeah. So I thought we'd read a little poetry just to demonstrate two things. One is the diversity of genres that this book includes. It's not just, we're actually not going to do Dolores. It's like really long. So you can just go right to the other poem, Assurance. Yeah, great. So perfect. So, a lot of times when people think of Jewish text, they think of rabbis writing, they think of legal, they think of midrash, they think of responsa, and those are important genres of Jewish text. But I think it's also really important to consider other forms of ways that Jews have expressed themselves, and that includes literature and drama and journalism and scientific literature and also poetry. So there's a lot of poetry in the book. In fact, if you only want to read poetry, you can go to the back of the book, and there's a number of what are called suggested tracks. So like little menus. So if you don't want to read the whole book cover to cover and you just want to read the poetry, then you can go to that first suggested track and it'll direct you to all the poems. So this is a poem by Emma Lazarus. Now, many of you may be familiar with Emma Lazarus. She's a prominent American Sephardi poet. She was from an old Spanish Portuguese family that had been in the United States for many, many years. And she's most famous for her poem, The New Colossus, which is inscribed on the base of the Statue of Liberty. So that's the poem that, many, many, many people associate very strongly with the Statue of Liberty, with Emma Lazarus, right? Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to be free, et cetera, et cetera. So that's Emma Lazarus. She actually wrote a lot of poetry. People that was like her one hit wonder, the New Colossus, everyone knows that one. But she actually wrote a lot of poetry. Some of it was published in her lifetime and a lot of it was not published in her lifetime. So this is one poem that she wrote that was not published. She wrote and kept it in her manuscript journal, and it was published in the 1980s was when it was first published. So maybe if one of you wants to read it aloud, that would, and it was written in English. So this is not translated. This is the original text. Sherry, do you want to read this maybe?
Yeah, sure. A light at her feet and a light at her head.
Oh, no, sorry. Assurance. No? Yeah, sorry.
Assurance.
Yeah. Wait. So, is that page?
Assurance. Yes, sorry,
okay,
my fault.
No worries.
169.
Yeah.
Last night I slept, and when I woke, her kiss still afloated on my lips, for we have strayed together in my dream through some dim glade. There the shy moonbeams sacred dared light our bliss. The air was dank with dew between the trees. The hidden glow warms kindled and were spent. Cheek pressed to cheek, the cool, the hot night breeze mingled our hair, our breath, and came and went. And sporting with our passion, low and deep, spake in mine ear and
Oops.
I lost Cher's audio. Did you?
Yeah.
Cher, we lost your audio.
Oh no.
Rory, you want to read it?
Come back.
Oh, well, you're back.
Here's-
You're back.
Sorry. Is that okay?
Yeah. Okay.
Want to give me a hint where you lost me?
Just start from and didst thou dream?
And didst thou dream, this could be buried, this could be asleep, and love be thrall to death, nay, whatso seem, have faith, dear heart, this is the thing that is. Thereon I woke, and on my lips her kiss.
Yeah, great, thank you. Wow. Whew. Okay, so this is like a different kind of text, different kind of, we don't always think about this when we think about Jewish text, when we think about Jewish history. We're not really thinking about this kind of steamy poetry. I mean, steamy, literally steamy, dank with dew, the cool, the hot night breeze. So I would ask you to just, let's think together, like what's going on in this poem? What's happening? What is this poem describing? I think.
Is this a fantasy world that we're seeing here?
Yeah. Okay, a fantasy world. What's the fantasy?
Of being together.
Okay, so she's fantasizing about being together. Yeah. There's a kind of there's a kind of encounter that is really at the center here. Literally and figuratively at the center of the poem is this encounter, cheek pressed to cheek. Her voice in my ear. So at the core of the poem is this encounter, which is described so vividly. It's very sensual, I mean, and sensory. Think of all the senses: touch, sound, sight, right? There's light, there's feeling. But if you look at how the beginning and the end of the poem, it's bookended by sleeping and dreaming, right? The first line is, last night I slept, when I woke, her kiss. And the last line is, thereon I woke, and on her lips my kiss. So the kiss and the dreaming are kind of happening at the same time. She's sleeping and dreaming, but the encounter feels so real, it feels so vivid, that her waking, which bookends the poem, is also tied to her feeling sure that this kiss is like somewhere there. It's real, on her lips somewhere. And in the manuscript, of course, you know what, I was just going to say, of course you can't see that, but actually if I share my screen, you could see it, right? Can I do that?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me turn off.
So I just want to show you what Emma Lazarus's poem looks like in her original handwritten manuscript.
And then we have all sorts of questions from.
And then we have all sorts of questions. That's wonderful.
We'll put them both on the screen in just a moment after Noam gets this up.
Oh, but where is it?
Go ahead and get on here now.
Okay, but I'll just say then. Okay, we'll worry about it later. In her manuscript, she has really underlined this line. This is the thing that is. It's underlined. In other words, there's a real emphasis that there is something true about this. This is the thing that is, even though I don't really know. It's not really clear what it is. What is it? Is it a fantasy? Is it a dream? Is it an encounter? Is it a memory? But whatever it is, there's this emphasis on declaring that it is real, that there is something that's true about it. So that to me is a really powerful reminder for a lot of the texts that we encounter in this book and a lot of the lives of LGBTQ people that we encounter in history that face a kind of denial, and they face a kind of historical silence and a kind of absence where even when we have records of their lives, there's a gap where we feel like we never are really going to get to the reality of their experience. And there's so much that we don't know, and there's so much that's left unsaid, and there's so much that we can never know about their experience. Like Emma Lazarus, for example. Emma Lazarus wrote this poem, but we have no way of knowing whether it corresponded to anything in her actual life. We don't have enough biographical information about Emma Lazarus, and tragically, she died very young. She died in her 30s. So, as far as we know, she never had any romantic relationship with anyone. So we don't, and we can't say, was this a poetic exercise? Was this a memory of an encounter that she had or wished to have? So, all of this is to say, there is so much history out there that we can see and appreciate and bring richness to our communities. But there's also so much out there that we have to say, it is what it is. This is the thing that is. It is what it is, and we can't get to as much as we want to really know the experience as much as we know our own experience. Excuse me one moment.
Sima and Sarah, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you all want to turn on your webcams too, we'd love to hear your questions.
I'm not 100% sure how to turn on my webcam.
Okay.
This is Sarah.
I hear you. Yeah.
Hi,
Sarah.
Hi. So I kind of was thinking when you were mentioning this poem that it almost seems like the context of the dream allows Lazarus the freedom to acknowledge something. And I also love the fact that she bookends the dream with such the waking world is so mundane. It's described so plainly, yet this dream has all this sensory information in it. When she says, this is the thing that is, this experience is more realistic, both to the reader and perhaps to the narrator of this poem than her actual life. The waking world doesn't have this color.
Yeah. That's great. That's a great observation. And it's true. It's not just true of Lazarus. Throughout the book, if you go through the poetry track and read all the poems, what you start to see again and again is that poetry in particular becomes a vehicle for expressing ideas and desires and for talking about experiences and emotions that don't seem to be possible in other genres of writing. So we have all kinds of really interesting examples going all the way back to the Middle Ages of Jewish poets writing about sexuality and writing about gender in ways that you can't find really in almost any other genre of Jewish writing. They don't write about these kinds of emotions in any other kind of text, but for some reason there's something about poetry which allows the creation of a voice, of a narrative poetic voice that maybe it's about plausible denial and maybe it's about creating a distance between the poet and their emotions. But for whatever reason, you're right that there are many cases in which the poem becomes a vehicle for kind of putting something out there that feels hard to say in any other way.
It's really wonderful.
Thank you. Was there another question about Emma Lazarus? Because I would love to read one more text and then open it up for general questions. Is that okay? Your mic is off, Dana.
We'll absolutely do that. I saw that there was a hand up, GRMRG, but I'll go ahead and add people back in once we do another text. Okay. So questions.
Other questions?
No,
okay.
We're good. No.
Great. Okay, so let's look at one more text together. And this is really one of my favorite texts. It's hard to say when you have like 120 children, it's like really hard to say, this is my favorite, but really there are a few texts that stand out as really one of my favorites. So let's look, this is text number 65. It starts on page 184. So this comes from the very end of the 19th century. This is actually the very last text in the early modern section. And this takes us to the very end of the 19th century. We're actually back in Izmir, coincidentally, back in Turkey, what is today Turkey. And this is a very standard genre of rabbinic literature. It's called a responsum, or in Hebrew, a tshuva. The genre of sheilot utshuvot, questions and answers, is how much of rabbinic law kind of happens. People have a question, they have a circumstance in their community, and they write to a legal authority who says, okay, let me check what Jewish precedent has to say about this, and then comes together with a conclusion. So this is a responsum. The rabbi who wrote it is named Yosef Palachi. He's an Ottoman rabbi, Sephardi Ottoman rabbi. And this text is really, really interesting, both for the question and for the answer. So let's read the question. I don't know if somebody wants to read it or I can read it.
Is a proper get divorce certificate necessary in the following circumstance? A certain man married a young Jewish woman and was with her in the manner of men and women, but after so many years, an event occurred to her and she was changed from female to male in every respect. What is the law in this case for one who had been a woman and married to a man and then became a man? If the husband wishes to remarry and take another wife, does this man need to give a proper get to divorce her according to the laws of Moshe in Israel? Or rather, does he not need to give a get for now or at all, since she is not a woman any longer but a man? Do not be surprised by this question, since all things are possible and there is nothing new under the sun. As you can
you can actually pause there. It's just a citation. He's giving a citation to a similar case that was discussed in another book from around the same time. Okay, so even before we get to the answer, this is already a really interesting, wild kind of question. Like, what is going on here? So a young man marries a young woman. They're married for some time, and then something happens. An event occurs, very vague language. An event occurs, and the person who had been the wife is changed from female to male. And he says, bakol mikol kol, in every respect. What is the law if this person wants to get remarried? And it's not clear. And I'll say, I think I made things worse. I'll apologize. I made things worse by trying to clarify things and putting this husband in brackets. I actually think I've taught this text in a few places, and some of my students have actually pointed out to me that is actually not necessarily the best reading, because in Hebrew, it's just pronouns. He, and then she, occasionally she, and then he. But it's not clear whether the he refers to, let's say, partner A, who was the original man, husband, or partner B, which is the man who had been a woman. When it says, if he wishes to marry another woman, who's the he? Is it partner A wants to marry another woman since his wife is now a man? Or is it partner B who is now a man who wants to marry a woman? I actually, when I wrote this, I thought it was A, but now I actually think it's B. Do you see that? I think it's actually, if he, B, wishes to marry another woman, does he, A, need to give a proper get to divorce her, B, or rather, does he not need to give a get since she is no longer a woman but a man? Like, who's getting remarried? I think now it's partner B, but it could also be partner A. The Hebrew is totally ambiguous. It just says he. Okay, so this is like a really interesting circumstance. And this is at the end of the 19th century. So I should emphasize, this is not speaking about the, this is decades before what we would today call gender transition was happening in a formal sense, in a recognized medical sense, like starting in Germany in the 1910s, 1920s, when people went to a doctor and said, I was assigned female at birth, but I believe I am a man. Let's change that into being being a man. So you have to ask yourself, what's happening here? Is that the case? Is that the case that this is someone who was assigned female at birth who says, I really believe myself to be a man, and they're just going ahead and transitioning like on their own? That's possible. That's one reading. Is this the case where there are also intersex conditions where people can be assigned female at birth, raised as girls, and then without choosing to transition into being men kind of through hormonal changes that are happening in their body? Or, I mean, there are probably other interpretations. Like, it's hard to say what exactly is going on here, but it's clear that this is happening. Like, something's happening, some event is occurring, and someone who used to be a wife is now a husband. What do we do with respect to Jewish law? And the response is really interesting. Let's skip over the first paragraph, and then he says, Palachi says, regarding our question, it seems that a get is not needed since he is a man. Now, he, clearly partner B, is a man now and not a woman. For the format of the get is that a man gives it to his wife and writes, you are my wife. But in this case, there is no wife, but a man. So in other words, the problem solves itself for Palachi. The marriage is automatically dissolved after this person's transition. This person became a man. The marriage no longer exists. So there's no, what's interesting to note here is part of what underscores that argument is because it's obvious for Rabbi Palachi that two men can't exist in a state of marriage, right? So if there are two partners who are legally, halachically speaking, in a state of marriage, and one of them becomes a man, obviously the marriage has to be dissolved because two men can't exist in a state of marriage together. So again, that may leave us today in a little bit of a challenging situation. But from his perspective, this person has transitioned to being a man. That's the end of the identity of the person who had been the wife, the woman, no longer exists. It's as if they're dead, right? And again, if two people are married and one of them dies, you don't need a divorce to remarry, right? That's obviously immediately the marriage is dissolved. So that's an interesting thing, again, to notice. In some ways, many people in the trans community speak about transition as a kind of symbolic death of one identity, a dead name, but that doesn't work for everybody. So, there are many people for whom that metaphor doesn't really match their experience. So we have to be thoughtful and careful about, thinking in some ways, we can see things that are happening in our contemporary society that map onto or match what's happening in this text. And in other ways, they don't really match up. And then there's the most interesting part. So let's go to the last paragraph. So it seems logical that since this woman has many visible signs that he is a man, as can be seen by everyone, he does not need a get since he is not a woman, but a full man, even as we have said, for this man who was a woman first and then changed into a man. So that's a long way of saying what we just said, which is you don't need a get. And then he adds a little piece of his own, as far as I can tell, his own innovation. He says, while we're on the topic, it seems to me that when this man says the morning blessings, he should not say, blessed are you, Lord, our God, ruler of the universe, who has not made me a woman. In other words, in the traditional liturgy, which Rabbi Palachi was familiar with, during the morning blessings, there's one blessing that men would say, which says, thank you, God, for not making me a woman. And Rabbi Palachi says, well, wait a second. Actually, it doesn't make sense for this man to say, thank you, God, for having not made me a woman, since in fact, he sort of was made a woman, sort of initially, and then turned into a man. So he can't really say that blessing in good conscience. So here we have a ritual. This is a really interesting example of a kind of liturgical ritual issue that is, dealing with questions of gender transition that is being faced by a 19th century rabbi. How are they going to deal with this issue? What does he do? He says, no problem. We'll just make up a new blessing. And he says, rather, since this person had been made a woman and was brought into the world in the form of a woman, so rather he should say, blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, shehafchani leish, who has transformed me into a man. He just made that blessing up. And what I love about that is it reminds us of the fact that up until very recently, most rabbis had that kind of halachic flexibility to say, we're faced with a new situation. We're faced with a circumstance in our world which demands a new kind of response, ritual, liturgical, legal response. Let's make a new response. If that means making a new blessing, let's make a new blessing. If that means figuring out what to do with divorce for someone who's transitioned, we'll figure it out. We'll use our common sense. But this blessing to me is such a beautiful symbol of the creativity and flexibility of this rabbi who is responding to an experience, something that responds to the tradition, right? He's saying, we're going to have a blessing. We're going to include it in the liturgy. We're going to say, this is something that fits within the frame of rabbinic tradition. We're going to tie this experience to Jewish tradition, and we're going to respond to what's happening and create a new contemporary liturgical solution, which in his case means making a blessing. And even though what's so amazing is that even though this is for sure not identical to the circumstance of, for example, transgender men today, right? This is like Rabbi Palachi was not speaking about that, I have to say, as a historian, right? Rabbi Palachi could not imagine, I think, could not have imagined the kind of gender transition that is possible today. Although, as he says, there is nothing new under the sun and everything is possible. So don't be surprised. And yet I actually know myself several transgender men who actually say this blessing in their morning blessings, who actually have now adopted and reclaimed this historical innovation to say, I am actually going to use this blessing as part of either as part of a ritual of transition or as part of a daily liturgical practice to say, Shehafchani leish, I praise God who creates transformations like this in my own experience. And that to me is a really wonderful example of the ways that we can use history in general and the way that we can use the history that's in this book. These pieces are pieces that are able to be kind of taken and reassembled. They're like building blocks. We can take each piece of history here that's in this book and use it to create and recreate and build something for our communities and our contemporary society. That there's something in which reading and encountering texts from the past actually might spark ideas for like new things that we could do now in the present. So that for me is like, if there's one thing that I take away from history and from the study of history, it's that the history is not over. William Faulkner famously said, the past is not dead. It's not even past. Like the past is alive and it's living in the present. And the way that it lives in the present is we are using it to create a future. So for me, that's what's exciting about working with history and about working with these historical materials is looking at them and trying to think about how can these texts inspire us and challenge us to reflect on what we see around us and move in new and different and more productive directions. So
can I jump in on some of this? Because
please jump in.
I found this one to be like, there's so much to unpack and I so much spinning around. I just love this one. But I think, both like from the halachic perspective of this also of he seems to see, like he sees a full transformation happening, right? So like the part that I also love about the blessing at the end is because one could kind of read it as like, oh, right, like so like in the example you kind of gave of like intersex, right? So,
Sure.
okay, like we thought this person was a woman, but it turns out we
Right.
were wrong. And actually it was a man all along, and like medically
Right.
made a mistake,
Right.
in which case the marriage was never valid in the first place. But he doesn't go back and say like, actually, right? Because like the blessing at the end says, no, this person was actually born fully female,
Yeah.
but has had this transformation. And it's a bold statement. I mean, I think you say it, but it's just worth emphasizing that particularly in the area of get seems to be where the rabbis are most stringent, in the sense of like, because like he's not leaving any room for doubt. If this person actually is really still female and is not at all male, then if this female person gets remarried, then they are violating the laws of committing adultery. Any
Right.
children that are produced are considered illegitimate children with all these, right?
Right.
Like, but he's not, so you could kind of just be like, okay, whatever, give a get, you know, it's just a piece of paper,
Right.
like cover all our bases.
Yeah.
He both, like through the blessing, is saying 100% like this person was born female, and through saying that a get is not necessary, he's saying that there is a complete transformation to this person being fully male. And he's not staying in ambiguity.
That's really interesting. You know what? I'm really glad you brought that up, because I haven't quite noticed that, but you're really right. He could very easily have said, just to be on the safe side, you know, we'll just do a get. But so it's really quite, you're right. It's really quite bold for him to say, really a get is not needed, and in fact is completely unnecessary. And that really affirms his stance, which is this person who, you know, has transitioned, has really transitioned fully in every respect vis-a-vis Jewish law. You know, that they really have become a man in, you know, and you know, bakol mikol kol. There really is no part of them that maintains, you know, it's not like those of you who were in the rabbinic text might remember the case of the androgynos, right? Where in the Mishnah says, you know, there are people who in some ways are treated like men, and in some legal situations are treated like women, you know, and they have this ambiguity where, you know, in some cases they're more like this and in some category, and in some cases they're more like that category. But this is not the case for Rabbi Palache. In this circumstance, he's saying, no, this is, I'm really prepared to stake a kind of a position that is fully, we treat this person 100% as the gender that they are now living in. So that's, I'm glad you brought that up. That's really great. It's a great text.
If I can also ask a question, and then I won't monopolize you, right? Yeah. But because, right, so in the question you keep bringing up the bakol mikol kol, right, like in every respect.
Mm-hmm.
And in his answer, in I guess like the third paragraph, it says, since this woman has many visible signs that he is a man, as can be seen by everyone. So I'm sort of curious, like what the defining line, right? So are we talking about like being perceived of as masculine, like how, because I feel like that's sort of the part of the question I hear that halakha also sort of dealing with is like, at what stage in the surgical or hormonal, right? Like, is there a point? But it seems like in the answer, he says, as can be seen by everyone, which seems to be more about outward presentation than, you know, more personal changes that might, like, I mean, private changes. So I don't, am I reading too far into that?
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. I mean, of course, in the 19th century, you know, he didn't know about hormones, you know, or chromosomes or, you know, anything like that. And, you know, even in terms of, you know, surgical intervention, certainly in the Ottoman Empire, there's nothing at all that is comparable to what we see today. So, you know, I think when he says, you know, as can be seen by everyone, I think he's really talking about, you know, outward presentation. I mean, I think he's talking about growing a beard. I mean, I'm guessing because I don't, you know, he doesn't give the specifics, but I'm imagining that in a circumstance where you have someone who has grown a beard or who has, you know, grown to be visibly, physically masculine, he says, all right, when you look at this person and you see a man, then that's clear that this person is a man. You know, so we're not that, you know, that, you know, and what he says in that middle paragraph that we skipped over, which is really interesting, is he appeals to what in his time was sort of modern science, which is, he says, look, scholars of anatomy have written, books about this, and he believes that they've said that basically male bodies and female bodies share all of the same parts. They're just like physically in different configurations. And so it's not impossible that someone's body, which had initially sort of looked female, could like contract and expand in different places to like turn into a male body. Which again, I think it's not quite what we're seeing today, but it's a kind of comfort or like ease with saying like, really, there's not that much difference between a man and a woman physically, except that there's sort of this outward character that people see. So like, if you take one character and you just like push certain parts in and pull certain parts out, then they become a different character. And what matters is like what this person, how this person is perceived in the community. That's what I think he's going for. There are other stories which are really interesting, which I'll leave for you to read, especially the CRC people who are going to continue going into the 20th century in the next sessions. But there are other texts where we have real examples where someone transitioned. It seems like we don't really know how, but they like were presenting as a woman, and then they left and they came back to the community, and now they're presenting as a man, and the community immediately accepts them and reintegrates them into their community as a man, including halachically. There's this story that I'll give you the citation. It's source number 96. Of this someone from a small shtetl in Ukraine who was raised as a woman, but goes to this small shtetl and then comes back, goes to Odessa, comes back as a man. And when they come back to the shtetl, he is married to a woman and counted in the minyan at synagogue. In other words, very clearly treated as a man in every respect, including halachically speaking, including legally speaking. And in that case, it's not clear what kind of medical intervention there was, if any, other than to alter their external physical appearance. And that was enough to say, this person, as soon as we saw them, we knew they were a man, and we reintegrated them into the community as a man immediately. We didn't ask questions about where they are in the process. We didn't try to look in their, in their pants. We took their word and we reintegrated them, at their word. So there are examples where that's the case, but I think it really was something that was decided on a community to community basis. But you're right that it's a really fascinating text, and it raises in some ways certainly more questions than answers. Speaking of questions, I would love to open it up to questions. If anybody is watching now, if people are watching on Facebook and have questions, they can click the link. Is that right? And they can come and type the questions into the Zoom.
Yes, absolutely. Click the link at the top, join the Zoom, and you can put in your questions. If you are in the Zoom right now and you have a question, you can there's some way to hold up your hand.
Oh yeah, there's also there's a chat.
And
there's a Q&A feature.
Do any of those. Type in a Q&A or put up your hand.
Great.
We will move you in here. grmrg@aol.com. You had your hand up, so I'm going to put you in here. I hope the hand up was on purpose. Otherwise, hello. And you're there, grmrg, if you unmute yourself. But you have to unmute yourself. And while we're waiting for that and other questions, any other thoughts, Shira?
Here, let's see. Someone wrote, have you read Alan Bray's book, The Friend? It's a great look at queerness and Christianity through history. I have not. I will put it on my list. The Friend. I love that. There are some great books about queerness and LGBTQ identity in general in history and in Christian history in particular. And I will point you to the bibliography in my book, which has many citations of them. I'll say that I was influenced very strongly by John Boswell's book, Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality, which it's astonishing to say, but was published 40 years ago, which is really amazing. A groundbreaking book, and in many ways, a book that laid the groundwork for this. And the other book that I have to say is Jonathan Ned Katz's Gay American History, which is an anthology. It was the first ever anthology of LGBTQ history. It was published, unbelievably, in 1976. It's astonishing. It's an incredible work. Jonathan Ned Katz himself is still alive and kicking in New York City, and he was very helpful in putting this book together. But it's definitely the case, and I want to make this very clear, that this book rests on the shoulders of many, many other books, anthologies, historical works, books of analysis, memoirs, essays. Many, many scholars of my generation, of older generations. I cannot take credit for finding all of these texts. A lot of people ask me, like, how did you find all these texts? Well, many of them I found because they were cited in other people's books. So I did a lot of reading and research and going through other people's books, finding the texts they cited, and then, kind of following footnotes back until I found original primary texts. Someone asks, may I ask what your pronouns are? My pronouns are he, him. Thank you for asking. That is great. Let's see, what other questions can we ask here? Someone looks like a question about 5-alpha reductase deficiency. Yeah, that's one of the intersex conditions that is definitely possible, and there are definitely a number of texts in the book that probably relate to an individual in that circumstance. In fact, you can go to the track at the back, as I mentioned earlier. At the back of the book, there are suggested tracks which kind of group the sources together in different ways. So there's a track of different genres. And there's also a track by identity. So if you just want to read sources by women, for example, you don't care about men, you want to read sources about women, you can do that. And there's also a track, as you see here, that is called Gender Fluidity and Transition, Trans, Intersex, and Non-Binary Identities. So it's hard for me to say, in most cases, I don't want to pin down any particular, I don't want to pin down any text to say, here's what I know the truth is. This person was intersex, or this person was trans, or this person was a lesbian, or this person was this or that. Like, I'm not interested in doing that. And I don't think, as a historian, I don't think that's responsible for me to do. What I am interested in doing is honoring and listening for and recognizing and articulating the ways in which these texts speak to or resonate with different kinds of contemporary experience. So, for some of these texts, we might have a story where an intersex person could say, wow, this text really resonates with my experience. And a trans man could say, wow, that same text really resonates with my experience. And a butch lesbian might say, well, this text really resonates with my experience. And none of us have to say, we don't have to fight over it. I think it's really important to have, if I can use like a little bit of woo-woo language, like abundance mentality versus scarcity mentality. I think it's really important to have this kind of abundance mentality about history. There is enough history for all of us. We don't have to fight over claiming like, oh, the Maiden of Ludmir was a trans man versus the Maiden of Ludmir was really a butch lesbian versus was a gender nonconforming, person. I think it's the methodology that I've tried to adopt, which again, I've borrowed from other scholars in the field of queer and trans history. I want to honor the many resonances that each text has with people in the present without trying to confine it to a particular past.
Other questions from our panelists too?
I wonder if there's a way that we can see questions on Facebook. Do you think people are asking questions on Facebook?
I'll go look. Let's see.
Phil Stevenson asked, it seems that a get is not necessary since both partners are men. Oh, if a get is, then it says the president that men could never have. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. That's a problem. Which reminds us that, yeah, all of these texts or many of these texts are really ambivalent in that way, where, for example, we might want to affirm some parts of the text that, many of these texts, for example, like there's a lot of misogyny in texts that even might seem affirming to, for example, affirming to experiences of gender transition. There are a lot of texts that talk about, even this text that we read, Palache, right? Part of what makes this Palache text possible is underneath is his assumption that moving from being a woman to being a man is a step up. So like we want to encourage that, but I think he would have had a very different answer if it was about a man turning into a woman. I think halachically, it would have been much more challenging for him, I think, to have an attitude of creativity and openness to finding halachic solutions to that. Because I think there's an issue of misogyny that's at play. So we might want to affirm some elements of Palache's response, but also distance ourselves from others. Okay, here's another 2 questions. One, what surprised you the most when putting this book together? Wow, what surprised me the most when putting this book together? I think part of what surprised me the most is actually just how much there was to find, like how much there was out there. When I started putting this book together, I first developed this material for a course that I taught at a Jewish program called the National Chavurah Institute. And for that, it was like a week-long course, and I taught like a little packet which had about 25 texts in it, maybe 30 texts in it. And that was sort of the sum total of everything that I had found in like years of research. And I was really proud of it because it was really big. It was a really big source packet, and it was like more than anybody had ever seen before. And everyone was really impressed. And people showed it to their friends, and someone showed it to somebody, and somebody showed it to somebody. And I got contacted by a colleague of mine who is a publisher, David Zvi Kalman from Printocraft Press in Philadelphia, who said, I think this should be a book. And I said, great. And he said, and I want to publish it. And it needs to be at least 100. It has to have at least 100 entries. And I thought, oh my gosh, 100 entries. It's taken me years just to get to 25, 30 entries. Like there's no way that I'm going to get to 100 entries. And that's what surprised me was once I started looking, the text just kept coming. They just kept popping up. And I kept, and I very quickly got past 50, 60, 70, 80, 100, 110, 120, 100. At 150, I had to stop and say, let me do some editing. So I ended up picking 120. It's a nice round number. But that's really what surprised me is that, there's so much history that's out there that has been either hidden in it's either in some footnote in an academic journal that people don't really know about, or it's been discussed but never been translated into English, or it's been discussed. Another example, which we haven't really talked about, is that there are a lot of texts that relate to the intersection of Jewish and LGBTQ identities that have been discussed in queer or trans scholarship, but nobody seems to have paid attention to the fact that these are also really interesting Jewish stories, right? So they'll mention oh, so-and-so was Jewish, but they're not thinking about the fact that wait, that's really interesting actually that this person is Jewish, and let's think about what that means for thinking about their life as a Jewish life. So as I was narrowing down the book, I was trying to think I wanted to have as broad a representation as possible of the Jewish world. So I wanted to have texts from, every time period. I wanted to have texts from every area of Jewish life, from North Africa, from the Central Asia, from Southern Europe, from Western Europe, from Eastern Europe, from Northern Europe, from the Americas, from South America. And every time I thought, well, is there any way, how am I going to ever find a text, about this particular intersection? Like I was like, can I find a text about lesbians that was written in the Ottoman Empire? And then I would find one, and I was like, okay, well now can I find a text about gender transition that was written in, French? And it's like, oh, we found one. So, it's really, really surprising to me just how much history there is out there, and there's probably, I have no doubt, just as much material that I was not able to find that didn't make it into the book. Stuff that's, in people's attics, that's in people's memories, oral histories, so important to support your local, local archives, local libraries, local oral history projects, for sure. Okay, wow, let's see, some more questions. This book is incredible. Oh, thank you. I know it's hard to narrow it down, but what are a couple other of your very favorite sources? Oh gosh, okay, very favorite sources. Okay, it's really, there's so many of them are really my favorite. One text that I really love, that I wish we could have had time to read tonight, is a long, and I've excerpted it in the book, it's even longer in the original, but a long, mystical, mysterious, romantic kind of novella that was written by a Jewish painter, a Victorian pre-Raphaelite painter in England in 1871. His name was Simeon Solomon, and he wrote this weird kind of little booklet called A Vision of Love Revealed in Sleep. And it's basically a long midrash on Song of Songs, on Shir Shirim. And he uses these 3 verses from Song of Songs, and he kind of unpacks them and then returns to them over the course of this vision, which is a kind of allegorical vision about love. And here it's pretty clear that he means same-sex love, homosexual love, where he's trying to articulate, like, what does love mean, and what can we do about it? And at the end, he sees love dethroned and captive and wounded, and then he heals love, and love gets throned again, and then there's this revelation, and love whispers a secret in his ear, and he won't tell us, the reader, what it is. He's left with this secret about love that he can't tell us. And recall that this is just a few years before Oscar Wilde's famous trial for homosexuality, in which homosexuality is called the love that dare not speak its name. That's what's going on here. And we know that Simeon Solomon himself was arrested just a few years after writing this for what was called in those days buggery and public indecency. But in this book, he has this vision for love that he says, well, I can't quite say what it is now, but he says, but what I can tell you is this verse from Song of Songs, this verse that really speaks to me, which is, Ad sheyafuach hayom v'nasu hatzlalim, until the day breaks and the shadows flee away. In other words, there's something that's over the horizon. There's a horizon that I can see that is not here yet, but it's coming. There's like a queer future that's coming that I can imagine, and I know it's not here, but I see it coming in the future. And that to me is so beautiful. It's so powerful, and it's so amazing that I can read this text that was written over 100, almost 150 years ago, and engage with this kind of midrash that draws on Jewish text and draws on his contemporary life and speaks to me in the present. It's that's one of my favorites. Can you tell us how your book has been viewed by both the Jewish community and other religious communities? It's a great question. Certainly for Jewish communities, I would say I'm very honored and humbled to say that it's been received pretty positively. I actually was to be honest, I was a little disappointed that I haven't gotten really angry, feedback, hate mail. I was kind of hoping that I would get excommunicated, because that really, It really like makes headlines. It really drives up book sales. But no such luck for me yet. I have had a very positive response, and I know that a lot of synagogues have been reading it. A lot of Jewish high schools, a number of Jewish high schools have reached out to say that they're buying it for their library, which is like really amazing. Because again, I wrote this book because it's the book that I wanted to read when I was in high school, so that's really amazing. A lot of Jewish educators are using it and pairing it with other texts and doing really exciting things with it. So I've been very happy with the response that it's received. What I would love to see, and which is I think just now starting to happen, is I don't know if many of you listeners, I imagine, are familiar with Indecent, the Broadway show that's based on a Yiddish play from 1907 called God of Vengeance, which is represented in the book, which is a Yiddish play about lesbians. It's a great play. And Indecent, which is also a great play, is like a play about the play in God of Vengeance. And so, when I saw Indecent, I thought, well, this is amazing. And what's amazing is like the theater was sold out. I saw it here in Minneapolis. It was like all these people are coming to see a play about like a Yiddish text from 120 years ago, and people are like packing the theater. So I thought, wow, this is really a testament to how powerful these stories are. And I thought, okay, well, God of Vengeance, like we can put a check mark, like Paula Vogel, did that in Decent. So that's 100 out of 120 texts. There are 119 potential Broadway musicals left that are waiting to be written. Maybe not 119, I don't know if all of them would make good Broadway musicals, but there are, in other words, there are a lot of potential projects that could come out of this, academic projects, like research projects, but also musicals and movies and contemporary poetry collections and, modern midrash and fan fiction and maybe a PJ library book and maybe like a young adult novel, so that's just, I'm hoping that this book being out there will start to spark that. I know that there's actually I know of at least, let's see, a few examples. One is that there's a wonderful story in the book, which is of a man named Moïse Zekri, who was an Algerian Jew, a Sephardi Jew from Algeria, who moved to France as a young man around 1900 and opened a gay bar around 1905, which was really the second, but the first one was only a few months. So really the first/second gay bar to function in France, and really was at the forefront of modern like gay community in Western Europe. And this has been written about in the scholarship on like French gay history, but nobody seems to have really thought very deeply about the fact that he was Jewish, and actually not just any Jew, but actually an Algerian Jew in France in the early 20th century. There's like a lot of interesting questions that are going on there about identity, about ethnicity, about language, about class, about community. And I was contacted a few months ago by an Israeli filmmaker, two Israeli filmmakers who are of North African descent themselves, Moroccan and Algerian, who are going to make they read the book and they're going to make an animated film about Moïse Zekri that's going to involve, like, they're going to go back to France, they're going to go to Algeria, they're going to do research, they're going to like make this film that is about his life, and I'm like so excited about it. So stay tuned for that. But that's the kind of thing that I'm hoping we'll see more of. I think, do I have time for one more question?
We'll take as much of your time as you feel like giving.
Okay, maybe I'll take one more question, and then I do have some evening obligations to get back to. So let's see. Last question: is there a particular text that challenges you the most? Obviously, feel free to not be specific if this is too personal or not something you feel comfortable sharing. That's a great question. Thank you, Sierra. Yeah, a lot of these texts are very challenging. I mean, the text that we read at the beginning, the text from the Musar text, those kinds of texts which are so loud in their condemnation are very hard to hear. Excuse me. And there's a number of texts like that. And that's hard for me because, I I would identify as like somewhere between a conservative and Reconstructionist, under constructionist Jew, I used to say when we were growing up. In other words, I just because a rabbi said something doesn't like automatically make it super important to me, but I do take Judaism seriously, and I take the Jewish tradition and Jewish text seriously. And so when I'm sort of inside the Jewish textual tradition and I see a piece that seems to be speaking to me in a very negative way, that's very hard. That is hard to hear. But I would say the most challenging text for me are actually the texts in terms of emotional challenge. There are a number of texts here that talk about specific people, either Jewish people. We might identify them as queer or gay or trans, Jewish ancestors, people in our kind of ancestral lineage who were who faced incredible hardships and who were actually killed by other people because of their gender expression or sexual identity. And even with people's names. So there are a few stories from the Holocaust. There are a few Holocaust testimonies of gay men and lesbians in Nazi camps who had very harsh treatment, very harsh treatment. Sort of at the bottom, they were really the lowest of the low, because if you had both the yellow star for being Jewish and the pink triangle for being gay, you were really you were in for it from everybody, from all sides. So those were very hard. But the hardest of all, the hardest of all, is the memo of the execution of a Jewish man in 1403 for sodomy, in other words, for same-sex relations. So the record is a notarial record. It's from the bookkeeping archive of the Crown of Aragon, which was a sort of kingdom in what's now Spain, in eastern Spain. The record, the only record that we have of this person, the only place that this person has survived in history is this record, which is to say that Isaac Salomo, in other words, Yitzchak ben Shlomo, a Jew, was convicted of the sin of sodomy and burnt at the stake. And then it lists the expenses, 6 sous to pay the executioner. In other words, the money for the executioner, the money for the wood, the money for the pole to tie him on, the money for the ropes, the money for the oil. In other words, each step of the executioner needs gloves and the rope to tie him with, and the pole to tie him on, and the wood to burn him with, and all in all, it adds up to $36.17. That's it. That's the end of the register for January 12th. And then the next day they move on to, what the king had for lunch. And it's so challenging to me because it's so banal. It's so dry. And it's unfeeling that this is someone's life. This is a person that was killed. This person, you put this person to death for the sin of sodomy. And all they get is the nickel and dime record of how much it cost for you to burn them at the stake. That source, translating this, having this text translated and putting it in the book was really emotionally one of the most challenging parts of the process. But the way that I ultimately came to feel about it and think about it is that this is a kind of a tikkun in the Jewish tradition. We speak of a kind of cosmic repair, a kind of retroactive repair that we can do in the world. And so by putting his story in the book and bracketing it the way that I do with other kind of my own writing and with other texts, and having his name there, like somebody could say Kaddish for him now. Like he has been brought into a community, I hope, of readers who will like think loving thoughts in his memory and will do loving things in his memory, even if not specifically. In general, the existence of this book in the world, I think, is trying to effect some kind of tikkun to say, your life was valuable, your life mattered, and it made an impact. And we remember it, even if no one else remembered it, and if even for hundreds of years nobody remembered it. There is something powerful to me, I think, spiritually about saying, we remember this person's name and this person's life, even though that's really all we know about them. All I know about this person was that they were Jewish, they were from a small town in eastern Spain, and they were burnt at the stake for sodomy. That's literally all I know about them. But that I'm going to say, I'm going to put that person on my family tree, kind of emotionally, metaphorically speaking, and say, what happened to you was wrong. What happened to you was unfair. And we can't undo it, but we can remember it and act in the present to honor your memory. So, it's challenging, but there's also something that is an opportunity. All of the challenging texts in this book are also opportunities for us to respond in the present, in our community, in our, wherever we are, whether it's in Minneapolis or St. Louis or wherever we are, to look around and say, what can I do to bring a little more healing to the world in service of this project? So that's the goal. I think we're going to call it. I think we're gonna call it at that. How does that sound?
Noam, thank you. Thank you for this incredible book. If people have heard me talk about this book, they heard me say that I cried through your whole first session, and I was that last text there. You got me.
Yeah, it's a good one.
But no, thank you for this book. Thank you for doing this now of all times, and yeah. Thank you everyone who participated, who watched on the Facebook live stream. Just a reminder for everyone who's a part of this, we'll be back next Tuesday without Noam. And CRC has all sorts of stuff happening, from our Talmud class to Shabbat morning Torah study to our services. It's all live stream. It's all available.
Phenomenal. Phenomenal.
And if you know of anyone who's watching, if you know of anyone who's in need of support, please go to centralreform.org/community. We have a form you can fill out. We have laptops we'll give to people who don't have them. We will have teenagers train them in how to use them. All sorts of things. If you can volunteer, go fill out a form on centralreform.org, or if you know of someone or you yourself need support. So thank you, Noam. Thank you, Maharat Rory Picker-Nice of the